Hey, everybody. Before we get going today, I just wanted to draw your attention to workingcows.net/Nebraska. Some terrible things going on there with flooding and other complications from the recent storm there in Nebraska. So if you want to check out how you can help, I would encourage you to check out workingcows.net/Nebraska. Working Cows Podcast, episode 77.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, here with another episode for you guys, brought to you by the Global Ag Network. One quick reminder, as with all of these shows through the end of March, just a couple of weeks left in the My Roadcast competition. If you haven't voted yet, hit up workingcows.net/vote. You can vote once there. If you've already voted, I'd appreciate it if you'd share that link out. We've had just about 500 people click on that link and vote, and I'd like to get up over 1,000 before the end of March. So if you can think of anybody who wouldn't mind voting, that'd be great at workingcows.net/vote. Today we've got Trenton Stout on the show from Stout Seed, and really just was engaged by some of his live tweeting of the No Till on the Plains event. So I reached out to him while he was still there and said, hey, when you get back, let's set up a recording. And so we are going to debrief some of his experiences at No Till on the Plains. So Trenton, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
You bet. I'm glad to be here.
So you were recently at No Till on the Plains 2019, and I saw some of your stuff coming across my Twitter feed and decided to reach out to you and see if we couldn't sit down and record an episode. One of those things that caught my eye was if there is more carbon entering your soil than leaving it, your kids will likely farm your ground. If there is less carbon entering the soil than leaving it, your kids won't. And farming is an extraction business, so we have to be in the business of regenerating our soils, basically. So I have a bunch of ranchers, mostly, that listen to my podcast. Some of those guys are dabbling in cover crops. Some of those guys are running corn and different things like that. So can we just talk a little bit about the idea of carbon farming and no-till on the plains and some of those things to start out with?
Sure, you bet. So that slide is one that we see quite a bit at a lot of conferences, especially ones that are centered around regenerative agriculture or just even cover crops. And the reason for that is because we have such a diversity of biology below our soil that essentially takes carbon and mineralizes that to plant available nutrients. And so when we are in just a monocropping situation where we have a lot of bare soil, potentially we're doing some soil disturbance through tillage, even if we're doing just straight no-till, we've found that we cannot make the gains in soil organic matter because the root exudate and the carbon that we pump into our system is very important for sustaining the right type of biology that will essentially lead to an increase in soil organic matter, which, we could extrapolate from that point to things like nutrient density in food, healthier crops, healthier whole ecosystems, and crop resiliency, right? So I think the basis of the question is that you need to be net positive at the end of the year on carbon input. And if you can be net positive, that means that you can sustain beneficial bacteria, beneficial microbes, beneficial communities of just bugs in your soil that will essentially lead to a regeneration of that soil organic matter so that you're continually building soil. And that soil, even though you're going to lose some through things that are out of your control, like wind erosion, runoff with heavy rainfall events, whatever that may be that you deal with in your geography, It's can we produce more than what we lose, right? Or can we at least be a net zero at the end of the day? And the only way we can do that is through carbon input. And so I think that's really the basis for that slide. It's really the foundation of the regenerative agriculture movement. You know, a good article came out, and it came out from a company out of Nebraska, and they were pretty pivotal in putting on the No-Till on the Plains conference, and they talk about 5 principles. You know, and the 5 principles that they center everything on is keeping the soil covered all, you know, as long as you can throughout the year. From that carbon standpoint, we want things living and dying all the time. Minimizing soil disturbance. You need a plant diversity throughout that year. You need as much diversity as you can to feed, you know, those different populations of bacteria and microbes. You want living roots as often as possible. And obviously, livestock integration now has become a key principle to this movement, and also something that was very heavily talked about at the No-Till on the Plains convention.
Very good. Yep. We've talked some about the 5 principles of soil health and some of that, and I really appreciate that. And we are, you know, the Working Cows podcast, so we've tended to focus a little bit more on the livestock integration on cropland and some of those things. What were some of your takeaways from this year's No-Till on the Plains? Was there anything new and exciting that you were really latched onto, really excited to think about how you could integrate it on your operation and operations that you have influence over?
Sure. You know, I mean, one of the biggest things was understanding and just sometimes you hear things that are not necessarily overly complex, but they help, like, get your mind centered around bigger concepts. It's like the key piece, right? And sometimes you just have to hear things kind of broke down into simple sentences where you're like, oh, okay, well, that really makes sense. And I think for me, one of those things was the idea that, you know, you have transpiration and you have evaporation going on in how we lose, you know, moisture. And so in order for biology to be sustainable, we've always known, you know, it's about moisture. You got to have water. And if you get in controlling soil temps, right, big swings in soil temps will promote, will kill off some of your beneficial bacteria, will, you know, basically slow to a halt a lot of the bugs in your soil and what they're, you know, you want them working for you. And when you get them too hot, you get them too cold, they shut down. Or essentially, if you get them too hot with uncovered soil, right, like you'll just cook them up. And so, you know, that idea, there was a lot of guys that were talking about rolling big biomass, big, like 12 tons of biomass. You want 12 tons, you want 14 tons. You want to push that envelope as far as keeping the soil armor on the soil to keep moisture in and to keep biology, keep those soil temps low. And so that, you know, one of the things that they talked about that I guess was really important was this concept that transpiration buys you something. So when you have plants and they're transpiring moisture versus having moisture in your soils where you're evaporating moisture. So transpiration will always buy you something. So that living plant then through that transpiration process is actually, you know, creating root exudates and promoting good biology. Whereas if you're having evaporation from your soil, that's always costing you something because you're losing that water without actually putting it through a process that's being beneficial. So that was one of the things, you know, just looking at transpiration versus evaporation and moisture, how we're trying to control moisture, control soil temps through above ground biomass was very interesting to me.
Let's camp out there for just a second. On the idea of transpiration and the keeping above ground biomass to keep the soil temperature low. That's, I mean, basically one of the 5 principles, right? That's the armor on the soil or the you know, the ground cover. So you've mentioned a couple of times good biology and bringing in the carbon to fuel that underground microbial life. What are some of the things that you can do to make sure that plant stays there and that transpiration happens?
Well, I think it just comes down to having that living plant or living root system, something photosynthesizing, right? As long and as for as many days as you possibly can, right? So ideally it'd be 365 days, right? So that anytime that you're getting moisture from the atmosphere, whether through rainfall or whatever it may be, primarily through rainfall, you want that moisture to be incorporated into your soils, right? And so the only way you can do that is through good drainage, right? Through soil porosity and aggregation, or, through a plant taking it in and taking it in through its leaves and taking it in through its roots and, going through that whole process. So, it's just a difference of making sure that every ounce of drop we can get, we are cashing in on instead of, losing some of that.
So what are some best practices to make sure that happens? How do we go about? I mean, you're talking cover crops, you're talking...
Yeah, so cover crops is part of it. It's diversity. It's making, cover crops is a big part of it, because right now a lot of us are just cash crop, and then we have this period of time where nothing's out there, and it's just naked soil, or it's just whatever crop residue is left. And so the big principle there is to make sure that you have this continual system where if one thing's dead, another, you're kind of passing the baton off to something that is living. So that's really important. And then also just understanding that when you're going into the heat of your year, you don't want that ground to be bare, right? Because there's another part of that where if we get rain and we get infiltration, right, we can quickly dry that soil out through sun. If we get hot temperatures, if you look into August and some of our hottest times in Iowa, if we have a living, or not a living mulch, well, a living mulch would work too, but even a dead residue mulch where we're rolling down covers, you're going to keep that soil, you're going to keep a barrier or a buffer between, sun, which is going to cause evaporation. You're going to keep that buffer with those living residues in your soil. So you're going to keep that moisture in, keep those temps low. So, cover crops is a part of that. Rolling covers has become more, there's been more traction of that, especially in hot areas, places with hot summers, because of this principle. So
what is the difference in the benefit between a dead mulch or just crop residue versus a cover crop? What kind of a difference are we talking?
Yeah, so it's pretty staggering when it comes to things like we're talking about, like soil temps, right? And regulating soil temps, having that biomass above ground is very important. However, as far as building soil organic matter, there was Jay Fuhrer, he kind of talked about less than 15% of the carbon that's produced above ground in your roots, or so 15% of the carbon that's produced from the above ground biomass actually ever gets incorporated into the process of soil organic matter. So the remaining 85% usually you lose to the atmosphere. So, originally it was kind of always a no-no in our mind of ever removing residue. Like if you were baling corn stalks or you were baling soybean, residue, or whatever it may be, it was, boy, you want to leave those nutrients out there. You want to, and I get it that there's a lot more nutrients that we're talking about that don't play into carbon, soil organic matter, but specifically speaking on carbon, not water soluble K or any of these other things, there's really very little of that actually you would cost yourself from a soil organic matter perspective. And so that was, kind of a big, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that and what that all means. But, from my perspective, if we can build soil organic matter 5 times faster through roots than we can through above ground biomass, and soil organic matter is our number one goal. Now everybody has to start with a goal, but if that's my number one goal and I have cattle, right, like I would maybe be a little bit more open to the idea of harvesting the above ground biomass, just because I'm not costing myself so much from a soil organic matter perspective. However, saying that, if you're going to take the biomass off, you need to be coming back with a living cover crop preferably a high carbon to nitrogen cover crop, so that you are offsetting, that 15%, right? So you're still at a net positive position.
So you probably have an idea in your mind of what the ideal field looks like throughout the year and its course. Has that idea in your mind changed or been tweaked at all as a result of attending No-Till on the Plains 2019?
I think it has. I think it all comes down to your operation, though, and what you need, right? So, cattle are kind of the golden ticket when it comes to cover crops because, you can do all of these things, and any mistakes you can, in my opinion, sometimes they're not as detrimental because you can always take and move your grain or move your cover crop through a cow, for cheap feed, if it's a cover crop, right? If I'm chopping rye or chopping trid or whatever it may be, I can move that through a cow on a relatively cheap feed basis to capture a premium on the outside of selling that beef. And so, as opposed to if I mess up my nitrogen rates ahead of corn and now I take a yield knock because I wasn't paying attention to carbon and nitrogen ratio, that's detrimental, right? That's what gets people to say, hey, I'm done with this cover crop thing. This is costing me money. There's no way I'm going to do this again. Look at the yield I lost. Yeah. So, it's a situation where I think it depends on your operation, on what you can kind of do and what your ideal cropping system would look like. But around here for us, we're going to start looking at relay cropping. I think that's a way that we can help pay for acres when we're looking at, staring down the barrel of $250, $260 average rent cost for an acre around here. There's just no way. It's hard to bushel out year after year to profitability. And, nobody likes going to meetings and listening to, how much money they're going to lose per acre or whatever crop they're putting in. I think Adam Chappell was talking about the rice guys in the South, basically going to meetings and that's all they're hearing, is, well, how much money you're going to lose per acre. Nobody wants to be in that situation. So I think that, relay cropping for us is something that can help us pencil soybean acres, help us get diversity into our crop rotations, and it's something we're going to look hard at moving forward.
Could you define relay cropping for me? It's been mentioned on the Working Cows podcast before with Todd Bozen, but would just give me a brief overview of what that process looks like, please.
Yeah, so relay cropping for us and how that would look for us here, and I think even out west, where they do quite a bit of relay cropping, is it's much like a relay race, in that you pass the baton from one person to the next person on that different leg, right? And you're running this full race with multi-people. And so, for us, it would just be a two-person race per se. Well, actually, it would be three if you looked at it from a holistic standpoint. But, it's having, so if I plant rye in the fall, the concept would be I would let that rye go fully to seed, but I'm going to plant my soybeans. So here, let's just look at a scenario here. Let's say that I'm on 30-inch rows, right? So in 30-inch row, I'm going to plant my rye in 30-inch rows, and then when I come back, I'm going to plant my soybean on the 15-inch gap in between that rye. So that is that they're both growing at the same time, but I'm harvesting them at different intervals. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the rye off, and then I'm going to come back and harvest my soybeans later. And ideally, in an ideal world, you would be somehow have a rigged up contraption when you're combining the rye. Maybe you're seeding your fall cover crop. That's not going to get a lot of growth, but once you take the beans off, that seed's already out there, and you're just passing the baton from one crop to the other. And each one of those crops, if you have a good purpose, right, should have an ROI assigned to them so that we're returning as much dollars as we can, on that acre throughout the year while still maintaining soil health.
So you mentioned getting cattle out on the soil as kind of a golden ticket. I guess that was my assumption that you were saying out on that, grazing those cover crops. Is that always the best way, or is it sometimes better to take it off and bring the feed to the cattle? What does that look like in your mind?
Okay, so having straight manure deposits from cows grazing, right, into cropland is by far the best. And there was some talk around here in our area. We have a lot of hog confinements. And there was some talk about, a lot of times we pump those hog confinement pits once per year. And there's a lot of talk down there about how just having that manure in a pit, right, actually at some point that manure becomes anaerobic. And so when we have different species that live in our soils, most of the beneficial bacteria, and from my understanding, most of the beneficial microbes, they thrive in aerobic situations. And that's, in situations where they're getting plenty of water and plenty of air movement and so forth. And if you have lack of soil structure in which you're not getting a lot of permeation from moisture or from oxygen, then you turn those soils to an anaerobic state, and that's where a lot of the bad bacteria and the bad microbes kind of thrive. And so going back to the manure question, if you're pitting up manure, at some point, I don't understand enough of that other than what they were talking about at the conference. It goes from an aerobic state to an anaerobic state. And so when you're putting that manure back into your soils, a lot of the beneficial bacteria potentially could have been lost in that transition. And so maybe you're not getting as much benefit from the bacteria and the microbes and from that organic nitrogen source that you think you would originally be getting. So having a cow grazing cover crops in the field and depositing manure that into an aerobic situation, that manure those beneficial bacteria will always be there because they're never going to make the transition to an anaerobic state, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep, it does.
So I think that's where that comes from, right? This mob grazing. If you listen to Gabe Brown, or just having these cattle out there, or pigs, or whatever it may be, depositing straight sources of organic nitrogen. That's why that's becoming more and more of a key principle.
So you mentioned something that's definitely right up the alley of the Working Cows podcast, and it's the crop version of profit, not productivity. We're going to measure profit per cow, profit per acre, not pounds per cow necessarily. And so could you talk about how that plays into the crop system and what that looks like for you guys and how you're paying attention to that?
Yeah, so profitability obviously is everybody's goal, right? We just have a lot of different ways of trying to get there. And so, a good person for this is Russell Hedricks, out of North Carolina. And he talks a lot about just layering enterprises and trying to incorporate, different revenue streams for profitability so that you're maximizing, premium on every acre. And it's no surprise that, the American farmer gets 15 cents out of every dollar. 85 cents out of that dollar goes to, the big corporations or the marketing, people or everybody else that it takes to raise a crop. And so, it's about how do we capture more than 15 cents per dollar, right? That's what will lead us to profitability. And so on our podcast, we talk a lot about direct marketing and trying layering of these enterprises. And I think that, livestock integration is a layer of an enterprise in which you can, take something where you're necessarily not being profitable, whether that be corn or soybeans, feeding it through a cow, and then if the cattle market, depending on where that's at or depending on your practices or depending on your labeling, maybe you can capture that premium in a different revenue stream. And so I don't know if that answers your original question, but that's kind of our view on it around here.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think, the principles are the same. If you want to increase profit, you need to reduce the overhead costs, increase turnover, and increase gross margin. And how do you increase gross margin? You reduce inputs, right? I mean, and so some of these things of getting cows out onto that or livestock out onto that cropland is hopefully reducing inputs. Do you have any practical examples of how that could be demonstrated?
Practical examples?
Like real world examples of cows or livestock on cropland resulting in reduced requirement of inputs.
Yeah, so I really don't work with anybody that, currently is in that type of model. And so that's part of, I think, our burden, is to educate, right? Like this, there's a piece of this that's an education piece, and it's having these conversations. I mean, we have guys that are finally, starting to, we've gone from, to give you a little background to just kind of our area, we at one point had a lot of livestock. And then we basically moved all the pigs to confinements, and everybody's gotten rid of the cattle, since 1990s. And so we just heavily specialized everything. Like I said, we have really highly productive soils, and so everybody has gone to just monocropping, right? Just corn, soybeans, or corn, or corn, soybean rotation. And now it's this education piece of trying to get them to bring cattle back to the operation as a holistic approach. And so we don't really have a lot. I mean, we have guys that have cover crops for the purpose of chopping them to bunker it to feed cattle or in our neck of the world. But we do have a few guys that we work with that bit the bullet to buy 7 head or buy 10 head just to kind of get started. And so we haven't seen that fully transpire around here for the most part, but we have guys that are moving in that direction. So we're real excited about that.
We talked yesterday, and you mentioned that you guys are trying to advocate for people adding a third crop to that rotation. What does that look like for you? What are you thinking of there?
Yeah, so, that's really hard for us, and I know that there's a group out of Ames, Practical Farmers of Iowa, with Sarah Carlson up there, has been really trying to work on this for the past 3 to 4 years, and maybe longer for Sarah, but, we've kind of been trying to work on it for the last 3 or 4 years of how to realistically try to develop markets for a third crop, because we really just don't have any. And I think that there's some things that are coming through, hybrid rye, that's being a lot of research done on diet for pigs. Maybe that's a way that we can start getting some diversity on a third of our acres for some guys. And, I'll be honest with you, we think the gateway to cereals, or even the incorporation of a third crop in a rotation, is relay cropping for us, right? That would be the easiest step, because we do have, Washington County is the #1 cover crop adoption county in the state of Iowa by acres. And so we have a really good no-till community. We have a really good soil health-minded community. We have a lot of that's driven by nutrient management, as far as, because we have a lot of hog manure in this area. So cover crops is not something that we deal with from trying to get people to do. It's about getting that next step, right? It's can we take that cover crop to seed, let it grow as long as we possibly can, and then relay crop that with soybeans to help pencil a soybean acre, but also to show guys, to help guys get that third crop in the rotation. It's just, if you flood the market, you got to have a wholesale outlet. And so wholesaling, rye, at this point, that market has to be developed, and so in order for this to be successful on a widespread adoption, and so that's kind of where we're at right now, is trying to figure out all those pieces and how they fit together. And, ultimately, at the end of the day, with the idea that we can increase profit and decrease inputs, right? That's what you were talking about just a minute ago. And we think that, we can get by with less herbicide passes. We can keep weeds under control. We can promote by having, just the rye there in a relay crop situation. We can promote soil temperatures to where we want to be, healthy bacteria, all these good things, and, still be adding carbon at the end of the day. So, that's where we're at up here when it comes to that.
So you mentioned some of the difficulties that you face from the education standpoint. What is the paradigm that you're challenging, or what is the fear that people are coming up against when you pitch these ideas of putting livestock out on crop acres, or adding a third crop to the rotation? What is the fear that you are hearing from people as far as adopting some of those practices is concerned?
So Jimmy Emmons is out of Oklahoma, and he spoke at No-Till on the Plains conference. And he said something that I thought was really, really interesting. He said that change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change, right? And I think that agriculture is a really conservative institution. You know, like people are very proud of the way that they work their land and they raise a crop. And whatever practice that may be, they're really proud of that. They take a lot of pride in that. And so talking about changing a system in general is met with a lot of resistance, especially if you're talking to someone who is profitable, right? And so for us, our challenge is sometimes, I hate to say it like this, but sometimes our soils up here are so good. We get so much, we get all the good right rainfall. We haven't really had a bad drought. We talk about drought up here, but that's not really, a drought, right? I mean, there's areas up here that had 71 inches of rainfall last year, averaging, above 35. And I don't say that so that your listenership discredits everything that I'm saying, but it's just, we can get away with a lot, right? And so we have really good soils, we get really good rainfall, so we can bushel out to profitability a lot of the time. But what we don't understand is the cost of that, and so that's where the education for us comes, right? It's, hey, we can it's not about yield, it's about profitability. And you got to make that paradigm switch. And if you can't get there, which a lot of our guys, we have trouble getting to that point, is because, they're implementing cover crops, they're doing soil manure, and they're getting good yields. And at the end of the day, they're making money, right? They're going to be able to farm again. And so the pain of that change does not outweigh the pain of what they're already doing and staying the same. So until you can get to that point, right? Until the banker says, hey, we got a problem. Hey, this isn't working. Hey, we can't, give this, we can only give you so much on your operating loan, something like this, right? Where it really smacks somebody in the face. It's going to be a hard sell. I mean, it can be done. It's a longer process, right? So I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was a great quote, and I think it makes a lot of sense, on why we have some resistance to things, to the message that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I mean, for proof, and I know I don't want to fall down at the feet of Gabe Brown here necessarily, but I've interviewed him on episode 67. I just heard him speak this weekend, and I think he's in the neighborhood of like 4 or 5 inches of topsoil and in the neighborhood of 14 to 16 inches of rainfall every year, and it's working there. So, I mean, it's if it can be adding profitability to his resource base, I would say that the return on investment is only going to be higher on some of those places like you're talking about, with maybe more like feet of topsoil than inches, and 40 to 60 to 70 inches of rainfall every year. The opportunities there are greater. You mentioned earlier that you've got some guys that are just starting real small with cattle. Is there an opportunity to bring cattle in on a custom basis, where they don't own the cattle, but people are sending them to them to graze some crop aftermath, to graze some cover crops, some of that stuff? Is there any opportunity there that you've seen?
Boy, I don't know. That's a great question. I like I said, I mean, we just have so few cows around here that it's hard. It's not conversations that we have a lot. I don't know if we really get the biomass on our covers like we want. We do have some guys, Michael Vidito. I know he does some speaking at events, and he lives a mile from me here, but we've been working with him over the past 3 years on interseeding in corn. Multi-species interseeding at B4 in corn. And so he had bought some cattle to try and kind of do this, to be able to graze this off. But most guys are down to 22 pounds of rye. We're trying to get them to add diversity within their mixes. We're trying to figure out the time windows in the fall. and I don't mean to blow these up like these are major problems for us, but it's just, we're changing systems, we're changing paradigms, and we're trying to get guys to think about things a little different way. So right now it's trying to get them out of the rut of, just putting 22 pounds of rye out there is somehow doing my soil justice. And, if you listen to Gabe Brown, I went to the Soil Health Academy, Ray and Gabe put on, and they basically said, if you're not putting 6 species out there from a diversity standpoint, you're really not doing a whole lot. And I think that's where we're going, right? Like at one point it's, hey, we need to get some cover crop out there. Then it's, hey, we need to get diversity of cover crop out there, to make sure that we're feeding the right livestock under the soil, if you will.
Sure. Well, one of the ways that you are going about challenging those paradigms is through your podcast. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, so me and Mitchell Hora, who runs a consulting business, Continuum Ag LLC, he's from Washington, Iowa. We both kind of came together a year and a half ago, and just kind of talked about, what are some platforms to try to reach a larger audience. And so we came up with the TopSoil Podcast. We've been doing it for about a year. It's a work in progress. We're trying to find, when you're working with somebody, trying to figure out how to make all of that work when he's busy and I'm busy, and trying to get together and do this. So, we're playing around with it, but we've had the privilege of joining the Global Ag Network, which is a consortium of agricultural podcasts. And that's been, a good transition for us. But basically we just talk about these type of concepts, these type of principles, and promote soil health, through the podcast medium. So
globalagnetwork.com, is that the best place for people to find your podcast?
It is, or you can go to, the app. I don't know. I think on Apple devices, you can go to the podcast app, and search that. Topsoil is one word. And we're working currently on trying to get up on the Android platforms. But right now, if you want to go to the Apple Store or go to the globalagnetwork.com, you bet.
Very good. Can you talk to me a little bit about Stout Seed and what you're doing there?
Yeah. So, we're just a little family business. My dad started selling seed corn in 1993, and kind of one of the things I think most of our generation is finding out that, once you go to college, you come back, you kind of, trying to figure out where your place is in the world. And a lot of times, because of these razor thin margins, and depending on your farming practices within an operation, I got 2 other brothers, and both of them farm full time with my dad, and it's like, man, trying to support 4 people is probably a little much. So, the seed side of things was kind of where I landed, and being passionate about soil health, being passionate about regenerative agriculture, cover crops was something 6-7 years ago when I started, that was something that was implemented immediately, and it's, really been a good spot from us, just being able to preach our message, have conversations with guys that we're passionate about. And, we also, obviously we're in ag, we sell other stuff as well, but, we focus on cover crops and focus on doing things that we believe in. And so, it's been a good transition for me.
Very good. Anything we missed? Obviously a lot we missed, but anything else that you wanted to talk about today?
Yeah, okay, so 2 things I think that would be of value. I just briefly want to touch on. There were a couple of notes I had. Jimmy Evans, I spoke about him earlier, at Oklahoma. He made a comment that a living cover crop will actually increase soil moisture. And that's because it brings in moisture from oxygen or through the air, through carbon dioxide. It brings in moisture from the air and actually puts that into the soil. So when we talked about relay cropping, one of the biggest objections we always get is, oh, well, what happens if we run into a dry spring? Are we going to rob all of that moisture? And most of the guys that I talked to down there said that because of these new results at Award Labs, that there's not a significant decrease in soil moisture. So that's one thing I just wanted to make sure I elaborated on for anybody that's listening that may be thinking about relay cropping. The other thing I just wanted to bring up was, I don't know how many of your guys are doing PLFA tests, which is the phospholipid fatty acid test, or phospholipid fatty acid test. But there's a fungus that it does a ratio, it gives you a feedback on. It's called the saprophytic fungi. And saprophytic fungi are the ones that are responsible for the breakdown of residue on their surface. So if you have guys that are in corn situations that are having cover crops terminated above or before they plant, and we have this C to N ratio component that we have this tie-up of nitrogen, understanding where your fungi ratio is on that saprophytic fungi will, I think, correlate, from my understanding, to how fast you can break down residue. So those are just two pieces that, not really necessarily, they're related in a whole picture of everything we talked about, but just kind of things that I hope are just little nuggets of things that might help somebody out there. So.
Sure. Very good. Do you have anything to say to people who are operating mostly on pasture land as far as cover crops are concerned, and no-till and anything like that?
I wish I did. I really, it's not something that I see, so it's not something I really feel comfortable, I guess, at this point, maybe given any kind of knowledge on. But, I'm always interested in feedback. I will, you guys can reach out to me directly at Seed Junkie on Twitter or at Stout Seed on Facebook. I get messages all the time from people that have questions. I'm sure there's some fact checkers out there that maybe I said something wrong. Reach out to me. If you want to continue a conversation about anything, I'm open to that. So.
Yeah. And this is Working Cows Podcast episode 77. So the show notes page for today will be workingcows.net/77. If you want to go there, you can find all the links to Trenton's business and his Twitter handle and everything there. It'll all be up there at workingcows.net/77. I think one of the things that has happened in agriculture, and there's no pun intended here, this is just the way I talk about these things, is that we've become so siloed in our operations that I have no idea what row crop agriculture looks like because I've never been around it. And you aren't prepared to speak to, no-till and on prairie ground because there's no prairie ground around you, because when corn hits $7 a bushel, everything gets tilled under and put into corn. And so it's something that I think we need to figure out how to reintegrate our agricultural operations, our agricultural businesses. As my paradigm was challenged this weekend, we need to reintegrate our businesses so that people are having opportunities to get cows out on. Because, I don't know how far you would have to go to get a sizable amount of cows where you're at in Iowa, but it's probably quite a ways to get a bunch of cows to bring in to put on some of these acres. So I think it's, kind of one of the lessons that we learn is that we need to figure out how to reintegrate our businesses so that they are more holistic.
Yeah, I'd probably have to drive to western Nebraska, or Kansas or something like that, where you start getting into, big time feed cattle lot.
My point exactly. Yep. I didn't want to say that because I wasn't sure, but that was kind of what I assumed.
Uh-huh.
So Trenton, thank you for your time today. It's been really good.
Hey, I appreciate it.
Pretty neat opportunity there to get some of that stuff down in a recorded fashion and hear from him. And if you want to check out other Global Ag Network podcasts, you can go over to globalagnetwork.com and check those out there. Coming up next week on the show, really excited about this episode. I was reached out to by a listener of the podcast who said that they've taken some of the ideas and started to implement them. And I get to talk to Brett Wright about some of his experiences with that. So, again, just a reminder, workingcows.net/vote. Vote there. If you've already done that, I would appreciate it if you just text somebody that link who might be willing to jump through the hoop of signing into their Facebook page and voting. Again, like to get up over 1,000 votes. If we could, that'd be pretty cool. So really appreciate you guys and your community. Look forward to episode 78 with Brett Wright next week on the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.